So this is a speech about international finance. It goes over the history, what money is, what it should be, but how it's used today, and all the crazy stuff that happens throughout history, the patterns that happen over and over and over again, and ultimately how to fix this bastardization of money. The purpose of this video is to spread awareness and push forward a movement. This video briefly goes over the rise of something that is a cancer on our society and has metastasized on the whole of humanity. We will go over how the system works today. Next, we will go over how the system should work. And finally, I will show the cure for this cancer, with the cure for the cause of the cancer to be self-evident. Part 1. Early History. On planet Earth, there are many species of intelligent life. They each have a unique overall strategy for survival. Some steal, some love, some are violent, and some's main prerogative is order. The ones that love are the only ones that can stop this cancer, because there is another species and their strategy for survival is the same as a virus. To latch on to one of these other species and use them as a host. So remember, this virus causes cancer to its host. Next, there is a naturally occurring system that arises within the more intelligent species, and that is a way to facilitate trade, which they call money. Aristotle put it as, the purpose of money is to serve the members of society to facilitate the exchange of goods in order to live a virtuous life. Pretty much to make exchanges and getting along easily. But what to use as money? Something valuable and rare? Well, that sounds reasonable at first, but what gives something value? Gold has been used for a very long time, and its value goes up and down based on supply and demand. Invisible hand of the market forces transcend the individual and on everyone's agreed upon value of that product. And gold supply doesn't change, keeping the price somewhat stable. Sounds perfect, right? Why then has the price of gold bounced all over the place in recent history? Because that is not actually how money works or is supposed to. Remember, the purpose of money is simply to lubricate the professional relationship in our society. The truth is that anything can be used as money. The Byzantine Empire was a continuation of the eastern part of the Roman Empire after the fall of the western part, and it was built on its own money known as tally sticks, literally long sticks with notches carved into them. How is it possible that one of the largest empires of Earth's history be built on sticks, a purely fiat currency? Because that is what money is. Money is fiat, and gold is just a shiny rock. But you don't want to use gold because more gold can be brought in outside of the society or discovered. In other words, its supply can be manipulated. This next part will be the explaining of how this simple tool of humanity can be perverted, and the more detailed rise of the perversion of this simple, friendly tool of society, and makes it work for the happiness of that society, which is what money is. In other words, it will explain how this virus society turned the lover society's own tool against us in order to leech off of their host nation, and now the world. In the beginning, money was a simple, friendly tool of society that makes it work for the happiness of that society. This metastasizing of cancer began a long time ago with goldsmiths. They would hold people's gold for them and give out certificates they could exchange for gold. Eventually, they caught on that only a certain percentage of people would withdraw their gold at any one time. So they began loaning out more of these certificates than gold they actually had. Most of the time they would get away with it, and so fractional reserve banking was born. At the end of Rome, a declining money supply left only a small percentage of people owning homes in their own home. But the eastern part of Rome lives on after the fall of Rome because of tally sticks. These goldsmiths evolved into what would become known for a long time as money changers, and have in the past 500 years metastasized from a virus to a cancer of society. King Henry VIII of the 1500s relaxed the laws on usury, the crime against charging interest, and the fractional reserve money changers. So the money changers increased the money supply, making money plentiful for a few decades. Next, Queen Mary increased the laws on them, so the money changers began to hoard their coins, lowering the money supply. Next, her sister Queen Elizabeth I tried to gain control of English money. This pattern of the controllers of gold making the supply of money go up and down is very important because it will play out over and over again. Because next is King Charles. In 1642 was the English Revolution, which is said to be caused by religious differences. But watch what happens. By creating money out of nothing, which I will go over in a second, the money changers finance Oliver Cromwell so that he can overthrow King Charles. Oliver purged Parliament and beheaded King Charles. Immediately, the money changers are allowed to do whatever, and nothing creates debt like wars. So for the next 50 years they are in war. The money changers end up taking a part of London known as the City of London. Now for the next step in the evolution of money changers. Now they set up the very first central bank. London is still one of the major financial sectors of the world today. But London is not a part of the UK. They do not have democratic elections. Instead, the banks vote. The Queen can't even enter without permission since it's not a part of the UK. So the first central bank was formed, and here is how it works, just as every central bank works today. First, when the central bank is formed, the government puts up money to start it, and then the bankers loan the money to each other to buy the remaining stock. Also, a quick side note, the full money to start the bank was never raised, and never has when other central banks were rooted. Just like the votes are never received, just like when the income tax was passed in the USA. I'm guessing this pattern keeps repeating as a way to signal to people in the know that they make the rules, because from the days of the goldsmiths, a saying began that is known as the Golden Rule. He who holds the gold makes the rules. Okay, so back to how a central bank operates. In short, they control the money supply. The central bank scam is a hidden tax. The nation sells bonds to this bank to pay for things it does not have the political will to raise taxes to pay for. But bonds are paid for with money that the central bank creates out of nothing. More money in circulation makes your money worth less. The government gets anything, and the people pay for it in inflation. They want the central bank as a way to indefinitely control the nation's money supply without pesky Queen Elizabeth I getting in their way. They can decide if money is easier to borrow or not. If supply goes up, then more loans are given out. Then they tighten the money supply, so then a certain percentage of people can't pay back their loans and can't take out new loans to repay the old ones, so they go bankrupt and they have to sell their assets to the bank for pennies on the dollar. They give the politicians as much of this money as they want, as long as they secure the debt by direct taxation of the people. In other words, this is a legal counterfeit for private gain. Then, of course, the people of London began paying income taxes to back up these loans. We will see the exact same thing happen later in the U.S. when in 1913 the Federal Reserve Act is established, the exact same year as when the income tax form was introduced. And just like before, the votes will not be met. But why have a central bank at all? How do they sell it to the people? Well, first is the name of the bank. It is always named something so that the people assume it is a part of the government. The very first Bank of London is named the Bank of England, and is still today. The one we have today in the U.S. is the Federal Reserve, but it is neither federal nor has any reserves. Sure, the President appoints 2 out of the 7 people on the Federal Reserve Board to 14-year terms. It's just a show. Next, they tell us that the central bank's purpose is to prevent booms and busts, or to ease the business cycle. But recessions and depressions are not just a part of the so-called business cycle. There is no business cycle, and depressions are not natural. In the first 25 years, the Federal Reserve we have today caused 3 major economic downturns, including the Great Depression, and a depression in Japan, as we will see in 1989. In America's second, current being counted as third, central bank attempt from 1866 to 1886, there was a 760% loss in buying power, as the total supply of money was dropped from 1.8 billion down to 0.4 billion, with $500 million being disappeared in the first year, 1866 to 1867. This drops the money per capita, or per person, from 50.46 down to 6.67, equaling the 760% loss in buying power. Holy shit, what a failed program. Just from the outside looking in objectively, why would anyone not cut them out? Well, as we will see, the money changers evolve into international finance and will start wars over it, just like they did to King Charles. As a final cherry on top, if I were to charge you interest on money that I lent you that didn't exist, I would be charged with a felony, fraud. Also, remember the math. Besides taking people's land and homes, just like in Rome, it's not just an 8% interest the bank makes. It's 8% times the fractional reserve, also known as money they do not have, which, being generous, is 10 times the reserve. But some banks can be as low as 2% actual reserves, if not lower, making a bank's real income per year 80%. Plus, just think about the interest rates you deal with. Their real goal is to make as much money with other people's money as possible, for power, and as we will see later, how their goals expand. As Napoleon Bonaparte puts it, the hand that gives is above the hand that takes. Money has no motherland. Financiers are without patriotism and without decency. Their sole object is gain. We will see a similar sentiment just over 100 years later, 1815 to 1935. You may not have all the pieces for all this to make sense yet, but don't worry, it will. With the beginning of America, and finally enough ranting. Now let's go over in more detail what happened in America. Luckily, we get a short breather because this starts off happy. The American colonies began issuing their own money called colonial script, 100% paper fiat money, not backed by any shiny rocks. When Benjamin Franklin was asked why the colonies are so successful, he said, "That is simple. In the colonies, we issue our own money. It is called colonial scrip. We issue it in proper proportion to the demands of trade and industry to make the products pass easily from producers to consumers. In this manner, creating for ourselves our own paper money, we control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay to no one." This scared the Central Bank of London. So what did they do? I'm sure you can guess from what happened last time. War. What was the reason for the Revolutionary War? Let's see what Benjamin Franklin's autobiography says. The colonies would gladly have borne the little tax on tea and other matters had it not been that England took away from the colonies their money, which created unemployment and dissatisfaction. The inability of the colonists to get power to issue their own money permanently out of the hands of George III and the international bankers was the prime reason for the Revolutionary War. That is a direct quote. Can't get any clearer than that. Colonial script worked so well that the Bank of England had Parliament outlawed giving the central, so-called Bank of England, exclusive note-issuing powers. War to create debt and depression and get their power back. Luckily, America won the war, but the war brought inflation because of the money printed to finance the war, but they were able to relatively quickly recover. But through fractional reserve banking, this doesn't last long, and soon America has its first central bank in 1791, with the war ending in 1783. Maybe they said they will never let the inflation happen the way they did after the Revolutionary War, but surprise, surprise, what happens within the first 5 years of America's first central bank, which of course was named the Bank of the United States. In the first 5 years, prices rose by 72% as Congress borrowed $8.2 million. Thomas Jefferson said, "I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution, taking away from the federal government their power of borrowing." The first central bank's charter expired because the Senate tied on a vote to renew the charter in 1811. Well fought. But it didn't last long, and the Second Bank of the United States was put in 1816. This leads us to our next section, maybe the greatest American hero ever, Andrew Jackson. Jackson's main goal was to kill the bank, but this new bank's charter didn't come up for renewal until the last year of his second term. During his first year, he fired 2,000 of the 11,000 employees of the federal government that he identified as minions of the central bank. Thinking Jackson would not want to stir up controversy as the vote for his second term was coming up, the central bank asked for an early renewal. Of course, it made it to Jackson's desk for signing. Jackson was no fucking pussy and had this to say about it. "It is not our own citizens only who are to receive the bounty of our government. More than 8 million of the stock in this bank are held by foreigners. Is there no danger to our liberty and independence in a bank that in its nature has so little to bind it to our country? Controlling our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens' independence would be more formidable and dangerous than a military power of the enemy. If government would confine itself to equal protection and, as heaven does its rains, shower its favors alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. In the act before me, there seems to be a wide and unnecessary departure from these just principles." Jackson's logo for re-election would be Jackson and no bank, and later he would call them a den of vipers, but he won by a landslide, even though the bank poured $3 million into his rival. His Secretary of Treasury and his second Secretary of Treasury refused his orders to remove government deposits from the central bank and put them in safe banks. But now the central bank will fight back rather than only resist. Nicholas Biddle, the head of the central bank at the time, had the Senate try to kick out the third appointed Secretary of Treasury, and then Biddle threatened to start a depression if the Second Bank of America's charter was not renewed. He said he would do this by making the supply of money scarce to force Congress to restore the bank. This is what Biddle said: "Nothing but widespread suffering will produce any effect on Congress. Our only safety is in pursuing a steady course of firm restriction, and I have no doubt that such a course will ultimately lead to the restoration of the currency and the re-charter of the bank." And he made good on his threat. They called in old loans and refused to extend new ones. A depression ensued. Unemployment surged, wages sagged, bankruptcy soared. Of course, Biddle blamed Jackson for this and said the depression was caused by Jackson withdrawing funds from the central bank. The bank threatened to withhold payments which could then be given directly to key politicians for their support against Jackson. So naturally, Congress censured Jackson. Censured is a formal statement of disapproval, a form of public shaming. This is when Jackson lashed out, saying, "You are a den of vipers. I intend to rout you out, and by eternal God I will rout you out." If Congress could vote to override Jackson's veto, the bank would be given another 20 years to consolidate its already great power. But then a miracle. The governor of Pennsylvania came out to support Jackson. Jackson won and made a special committee to prove the bank had caused the crash. Biddle physically kept out these people with subpoenas from physically coming into the central bank to take a look at the books. Jackson paid off the American debt by having the government issue money, just like the wooden sticks from the Byzantine Empire. It would be the only time ever that the debt was paid off. In 1832, Jackson is quoted saying, "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Next, an assassin tries to kill Jackson, but both pistols misfire and promise to protect him if he were caught. Biddle was arrested and charged with fraud. He was tried and acquitted, but he died shortly after while tied up in civil suits. Jackson retired and lived out his life. It would take another 77 years for the money changers to undo his damage. When asked what his biggest accomplishment was, Jackson said, "Only, I killed the bank." But sadly, fractional reserve banking itself was overlooked, allowing the banks to consolidate power once again. So once again, what did the banks do to create debt and dependence? War. The Civil War. But wasn't the Civil War about slavery? A quick side note. According to an 1860 U.S. Census, 4 out of 5 slave owners were Jewish. The majority of bankers are Jewish. A funny coincidence. Not that it was racist in 1830. There were 3,775 free black people who owned 12,740 black slaves. It was a long tradition in Africa. In fact, North Carolina's largest slaveholder in 1860 was black. His name was William Ellison. The first legal slave owner in American history was a black tobacco farmer named Anthony Jackson. Anyway, here's a quote from Abraham Lincoln. "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the States, where it now exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. My paramount objective is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." It was the banks pushing this idea as a smokescreen. So what was the reason the banks wanted this? A German statesman, Otto von Bismarck, put it like this: "The division of the United States into federations was decided long before the Civil War by the high financial powers of Europe. These bankers were afraid that the United States, if they remained as one bloc and as one nation, would attain economic and financial independence, which would upset their financial domination over the world. So besides creating debt to get their power back, they wanted the South to win and break up the Union. But either way the war went, the weakened America would be open for exploit and in debt to the money changers. Britain put troops in Canada to the north, and the banks loaned Napoleon, the nephew of the Waterloo Napoleon, to bring colonial rule in Mexico, trapping the United States. This whole situation agonized inside Lincoln. So Lincoln went to the money changers to apply for a loan to win the war and keep the Union. They offered him loans at 24 to 36% interest. Lincoln said, "Fuck that," and had Congress print their own money. With the banks weakened from Jackson, they could not stop Lincoln. Lincoln printed them to make them stand out from other notes with green ink. These were known as greenbacks. $450 million were printed at no interest to the government. This is how Lincoln himself explained it. The government should create, issue, and circulate all the currency and credit needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and the buying power of consumers. The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of government, but it is the government's greatest creative opportunity. By the adoption of these principles, the taxpayers will be saved immense sums of interest. Money will cease to be the master and become the servant of humanity. This is the reaction to the bankers published in the London Times. If this mischievous financial policy, which has its origins in North America, shall become indurated down to a fixture, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off debts and be without debt. It will have all the money necessary to carry on its own commerce. It will become prosperous without precedent in the history of the world, which is exactly what we will see happen in 1933. The brains, the wealth of all countries will go to North America. That country must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe. This quote was in the Times of London. With Britain to the north and France to the south, and Lincoln winning his war, what stopped the banks from intervening? It was Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia. The Tsar knew what was going on and stopped central banks from being set up in Russia. So he knew that if America could stay out of the clutches of the banks, then Russia would be secure. But if America was split up, then the Britain and France under control of their central banks would threaten him again. So the Tsar gave orders that if France or Britain intervened, Russia would take that as a declaration of war against them. If Lincoln had killed off the banks, he could have regained full control because he needed more greenbacks to finish the war and allowed the passing of an awful act. That act is the National Banking Act. These new banks operated under a tax-exempt status and had the monopoly to create the new form of money, banknotes. Greenbacks continued to circulate, but their numbers were never increased at all, which is what Lincoln originally wanted, which quickly explained by the historian John Kenneth Galbraith. In numerous years following the war, the federal government ran a heavy surplus. It could not pay off its debts, retire its securities, because to do so meant there would be no bonds to back the national banknotes. To pay off the debt was to destroy the money supply. The important takeaway from this is that from this point on, America would have a debt-based money system. The entire money supply would be created out of debt by bankers buying U.S. government bonds and issuing them for reserves for banknotes. So the banks got their power. Lincoln wrote a friend the following: "The money power preys upon the nation in times of peace, and conspires it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy." Lincoln's former secretary, Salmon P. Chase, had great regret in passing the National Bank Act. He said, "My agency in promoting the passage of the National Banking Act was the greatest financial mistake of my life. It has built up a monopoly which affects every interest in the country." This was Otto von Bismarck's reaction to Lincoln's death. The death of Lincoln was a disaster for Christendom. There was no man in the United States great enough to wear his boots. I fear that foreign bankers, with their craftiness and treacherous tricks, will entirely control the exuberant riches of America and use it to systematically to corrupt modern civilization. They will not hesitate to plunge the whole of Christendom into wars and chaos in order that the earth should become their inheritance. After Lincoln's death, this is when the 20-year period from 1866 to 1886, where there was a 760% loss in buying power that I had mentioned before. This was partly to get rid of the greenbacks in circulation. Another interesting note is that greenbacks were in circulation until 1994. To consolidate power further, the gold standard was set up after Lincoln's death. Once again, gold is used because it is more scarce, so it is easier to control. They didn't want silver because it is harder to control. There is 15 times more of it, so it is 15 times harder to control. In 1872, they even stopped the production of silver coins. With no more threat to the money changers' power, they began letting more money flow, and the post-Civil War depression was over. 3 years later, President Garfield, after he became president, slammed the bankers. He was in finance his whole life, but once he became president, he spoke out against them. And this is what he said: "Whosoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. And when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled one way or another by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate." Within a few weeks, Garfield was assassinated. Over the next years, highs and lows came, and thousands of lands and homes were bought up by the bankers. A memo was put out by the American Bankers Association, the ABA. This memo set a date for all bankers to create a depression on a set date 3 years in the future. Here is how it read: "On September 1st, 1894, we will not renew our loans under any consideration. On September 1st, we will demand our money. We will foreclose and become mortgagees in possession. We can take 2/3 of all the farms west of the Mississippi, and thousands of them east of the Mississippi as well, at our own price. Then the farmers will become tenants, as in England." 1891, American Bankers Association, as printed in the Congressional Record of April 29, 1913. It was the gold standard that allowed them to accomplish this. The people called the outlaw of silver the crime of '73. The president and his speech that won him the nomination is known as one of the most famous speeches before a national convention. His conclusion is as follows: "We will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon this brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." He lost. and here comes the new privately owned Central Bank of America. The Panic of 1907. From 1900 to 1910, 70% of corporate funding for corporate expansion came from the corporation's own profits rather than loans. The economy of the USA was doing so well, so of course the bankers had to put a stop to their missing out on such a large market. J.P. Morgan, head of J.P. Morgan, an American multinational investment bank, was controlled by international finance. His job was to monopolize industry on behalf of the banks. But after his death, it was found that he owned only a fraction of what other people thought, only a few $1 million. So him and the banks crashed the stock market. Some banks only had 1% reserves, so bank runs became common only days after the stock market crashed. This caused the Panic of 1907, and Congress allowed J.P. Morgan to bail out the banks with money he did not have. $200 million. That sum was even given to his own banks to be lent out at interest. He is supposedly a hero now. In 1913, the central bank was back through the Federal Reserve Act, and that same year, the federal income tax was put in place by the Revenue Act of 1913 as a way of securing the debt with taxes, just like London's central bank back in 1694. This is the central bank we have today, named deceitfully as the Federal Reserve. Here is the central bank's money-making process that we have today for our debt-based currency. 1. Their open market committee approves the purchase of U.S. bonds. 2. Bonds are purchased by the central bank. 3. They pay for the bonds with electronic credit to the seller's bank. These credits are based on nothing. 4. Banks use these deposits as reserves. They can loan out over 10 times the amount of their reserves to new borrowers, all at interest. This does the following: misdirects banking reform efforts, prevents greenbacks from making a comeback, delegates to all bankers the right to create 90% of our money supply, centralized overall control of our nation's money supply in the hands of a few men, and finally established a central bank with a high degree of independence from effective political control. Thomas Edison has an interesting quote on this. If our nation can issue a dollar bond, it can issue a dollar bill. The element that makes the bond good makes the bill good also. The difference between the bond and the bill is the bond lets money brokers collect twice the amount of the bond and an additional 20%, whereas the currency pays nobody but those who contribute directly in some useful way. It is absurd to say that our country can issue 30 million in bonds and not 30 million in currency. Both are promises to pay, but one promise fattens the usurers and the others help the people. Where was the president during all of this? Woodrow Wilson. He had no idea what he was doing or how the system worked. Focused on other things, he did not realize what he had done until near the end of his life. He is quoted saying, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, in all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world, No longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men. So what happens next? Now the story is old. What happens after a central bank is created? It celebrates in a debt party. Nothing creates debt like war. World War I. But after World War I, still the USA economy does too good, and debt is cut by 38%, despite World War I creating 10 times more debt than the Civil War. So the Fed does what it always does, but even bigger. It floods us with money, increasing the money supply by 62%. This is what we refer to as the Roaring Twenties, and we all know what happens after, the Great Depression. In 1929, the central bank starts tightening money. Called-in loans forcing people to sell stocks to pay for the loans, crashing the market. This is known as Black Thursday. From 1929 to 1933, the Fed continued to reduce the money supply by an additional 33%, or 1/3 of all money. Remember, they could have just as easily lowered the interest rates and done the opposite instead. Also, now that America has fallen, the fears of Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia from Lincoln's days, finally comes to fruition. But then they become communist. Why would the banks want communism? The system that was openly vowing to destroy the so-called capitalism that made them wealthy. A researcher, Gary Allen, explained it this way. If one understands that socialism is not a share the wealth program, but is in reality a method to consolidate and control the wealth, then the seeming paradox of the super-rich men promoting socialism become no paradox at all. Instead, it becomes logical, even the perfect tool of power-seeking megalomaniacs. Communism, or more accurately, socialism, is not a movement of the downtrodden masses, but of the economic elite. Another researcher, W. Cleon Skousen, says, power from any source tends to create an appetite for additional power. It was almost inevitable that the super-rich one day aspire to control not only their wealth, but the wealth of the whole world. To achieve this, they were perfectly willing to feed the ambitions of the power-hungry political conspirators who were committed to the overthrow of all existing governments and the establishments of a central worldwide dictatorship. They can give money to these so-called revolutionaries when they obey, and give them no money when they don't, or even give money to their opposition. This is a good time to point out Black Lives Matter and research the communist pincer movement, which is money given to the top and to the bottom, so that the silent majority takes their sides when they see the people on top and the bottom saying the same thing. Then the sheep follow, just like Black Lives Matter and Bernie Sanders. Anyway, the new communist dictator Lenin admits that his dictatorship is actually controlled. This is what he had to say. The state does not function as we desired. The car does not obey. The man is at the wheel and seems to lead it, but the car does not drive in the desired direction. It moves as another force wishes. Representative Louis T. McFadden from Pennsylvania reacted to it like this. The course of Russian history has, indeed, been greatly affected by the operations of international bankers. The Soviet government has been given United States Treasury funds by the Federal Reserve Board, acting through the Chase Bank. England has drawn money from us through the Federal Reserve banks and has relent it at higher rates of interest to the Soviet government. The Dniprospetrovsk Dam was built with funds unlawfully taken from the United States Treasury by the corrupt and dishonest Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks. But what about the people? When you have a democracy, you only need to control the lowest common denominator, and the bank controls the media. Theodore Roosevelt puts it like this: these international bankers and the Rockefeller Standard Oil interests control the majority of newspapers, and the columns of these papers to club into submission or drive out of public office officials who refuse to do the bidding of the powerful corrupt cliques which compose the invisible government. John Hylam, the mayor of New York, said on March 26, 1922, that the warning of Theodore Roosevelt has much timeliness today, for the real menace of our republic is this invisible government which, like a giant octopus, sprawls its slimy length over city, state, and nation. It seizes in its long and powerful tentacles our executive officers, our legislative bodies, our schools, our courts, our newspapers, and every agency created for the public protection. To depart from mere generalizations, let me say that at the head of the octopus are the Rockefeller Standard Oil interests, and a small group of powerful banking houses, generally referred to as the international bankers. The little coterie of powerful international banks virtually run the United States government for their own selfish purposes. They practically control both parties, write political platforms, make cat paws out of political leaders, use the leading men of private organizations, and resort to every device to place in nomination for high public office only such candidates as will be amenable to the dictates of corrupt big business. These international bankers and Rockefeller Standard Oil interests control the majority of newspapers and magazines in this country. End quote. Why wasn't all this dealt with? In the Roaring '20s, times were good, and no one cares about economic issues in times of prosperity, or seemingly prosperous times. Next, in 1937, the president said to get out of this depression that the country must pool their resources, and ordered Americans to sell their gold to the government for the creation of Fort Knox. This sets the stage for World War II, which will have 30 times the spending of World War I. The American taxpayer will pick up 55% of the total Allied cost of World War II, and every nation multiplied their debt in World War II. USA debt went up 559%, from $43 billion to $257 billion. Japan's rose 1,448%. French debt rose 538%, and Canada's debt rose 417%. But what caused World War II? Besides Hitler taking a small chunk of Germany back because it was his people being genocided in the part of Germany lost from World War I, and besides Hitler doing everything possible to prevent and later stop World War II, he had done the biggest crime in the history of the banks. He got rid of the central bank in Germany, and just like colonial scrip of early American colonies, he issued his own money and made Germany go from the poorest European country to the richest and most prosperous, virtually eliminating unemployment. Hitler saw who the goldsmiths were, and that the goldsmiths evolved into the money changers who turned into the international bankers, and simply wanted the German people to be free and not a slave, because that is the real goal of banks. Quote, in order so that the earth should become their inheritance. Otto von Bismarck. Again, after Lincoln's death, he was a German statesman also. Sadly, the world banks crushed this Goyim that escaped his cage, and made an example of him, and still do to this day, demonizing Nazis for becoming free, 12 years not a slave. But what about all that gold stolen from the people in Fort Knox? At the end of World War II, it held 70% of the world's gold supply. This gold is supposed to be owned by the American people. This so-called pooling of gold finally ended with President Nixon, who finally made it legal for Americans to purchase gold. But there hasn't been an audit of Fort Knox since 1953. It was Ronald Reagan who created a gold commission who were appointed to see if it was feasible to go back to the gold standard. But what they found was that all gold in Fort Knox was owned by the Federal Reserve. They had gotten the government to use it to pay for loans. So all American gold has disappeared to anonymous European speculators. With no audit, we don't even know that the armed guards are even guarding 1% of the gold. So World War II centralized the world banks. That was the ultimate outcome of World War II. So here are the 3 parts of their plan to centralize economic systems of the entire world. First, you have the 3 pillars: the United Nations, the World Bank, that issues world currency in the form of SDR, special drawing rights. This is already accepted by America. And finally, a world court. First, the central bank domination of national economics worldwide. This is already done. Second, centralize regional economics such as the European Monetary Union. Yes, that one. And NAFTA. Third, centralize the world economy. Abolish all tariffs like GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the establishment of a World Central Bank. The World Central Bank has 3 pillars: the World Bank, the BIS, Bank for International Settlements, and the IMF, International Monetary Fund. The IMF controls 2/3 of the world gold today. The Golden Rule: he who controls the gold makes the rules. They now control the money supply of the world today, and they are already contracting world credit today, which will lead to a world depression. What? How are they doing this? All these claims you're making are crazy. You're crazy. Well, in 1988, regulations put in by the BIS made requirements that world bankers must raise their capital in reserves to 8% of liabilities by 1992. In other words, this is an upper limit to fractional reserve lending. This seems so insignificant, right? Well, this insignificant regulation means that our banks cannot loan more and more money to buy more and more time until the next depression, as a max loan ratio is now set, so it will eventually be hit. Banks without the reserves already had to sell stock to meet requirements, making countries' economies contract. This can be seen the most in Japan in 1989. This caused a depression that wiped out 50% of the value of its stock market and 60% of the value of its commercial real estate. This is the radical transfer of power to the World Central Bank. They will decide which nations receive loans and which ones starve. The exact same pattern all this money can't buy one out of debt because all money is made out of debt. The purchasing power from the creation of the central bank in 1913, when $1 equaled $1, has dropped down to 5 cents in purchasing power in 2013. Today, the NIA, National Income Accountants, who figure out GDP, can't figure out what to do with the financial sector when calculating GDP by adding up the value-added activities. So they have to make up a value because what they actually find is that value is not added and actually needs to be subtracted from GDP. Henry Ford is quoted saying, "It is well enough that the people of this nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." So what can we do about this? Luckily, the solution is very easy. Unlike the human body, it does not damage us to cut out this cancer. The solution can be solved very quickly, and the people won't even know or be affected during the process of getting away from a debt-based currency. But suddenly, afterwards, many taxes will not be needed. Executive order backed by the military, because a weak economy is a weak nation, and that is a national defense emergency. The people cannot function with 20% of their paycheck taken away and then be charged 10% for the food that they buy with what is left, and then owe 15% of the money they pay on their mortgage and buy a new registration for their car every year, then pay 15% for its gasoline on top of that. And then, when they buy any assets with their taxed money, they also get taxed another 10%. Every penny earned and spent will be taxed no longer to make someone else rich. This is what we're going to do. First, we will pay off the debt bonds with money printed by our government. But wouldn't this create crazy inflation, you ask? As the Treasury buys the bonds with USA printed money, the reserve requirements of the banks will be raised in proportion so money in circulation is constant until we have 100% reserve banking. This will destroy the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 and the National Banking Act of 1864 without even having to go through the logistical nightmare of repealing them. These horrific acts will be rendered useless because they are based on a fractional reserve banking system. Now, monetary power is back to the people, and money becomes the tool it should be and not the enslaver. The money supply will be only increased with population. More people equals more workers, equals we are all richer. Now, this part is just my opinion, but any government surplus should be used for robots, because robots will decrease the workload, so more money plus less work means we get richer for free. The danger of depressions are eliminated, and there will be no threat of a war that could cause a depression if we must recover from a war, because we are the biggest by far, and no one will fuck with us in a real significant way with no central bank dragging us to do their bidding, because we will be in debt to no rootless international clique. You might think it's too simple, but remember, the Byzantine Empire's tally sticks of wood. Any money is good as long as it is only usable for the payment of taxes. Now all this could be done in just 1 year, and for good measure, outlaw fractional reserve banking and treat it as the fraud that it is. Remember, there is nothing wrong with interest on loans. It is fractional reserve banking, lending out money that does not exist. we must also withdraw from all three arms of the World Bank. I also believe blockchain currency could also be implemented in the future as a way of securing currency exchange. If you need a real-world example, a small island named Guernsey, debt-free money system, 100% fiat, that is how they operate. One more thing to remember, that the stock market is not the economy. When a stock market crashes, it only wipes out market speculators. In the Great Depression, it was only a smokescreen for the great money supply contraction. Milton Friedman, an economist, said this: I know of no severe depression in any country or any time that was not accompanied by a sharp decline in the stock of money, and equally of no sharp decline in the stock of money that was not accompanied by a severe depression. So in implementing these new monies, the central bank will try to crash the economy, and most likely the stock market, just like it's done in the past. And most likely World War III, like what they did to Germany in World War II. But we are huge, and we have the internet now, and they won't be able to hide the truth this time. This is why the president must order people to pull out their money first, so that the least amount of damage will be done to the people in the death thrashes of the central bank. Or maybe even use the military to go ahead and kick them out of their places of business, and even make a record of where everyone's retirement funds were before implementing the changes, so that they can be reimbursed once the monster is slain. This is what David Rockefeller, the head of Chase Manhattan Bank, the largest Wall Street bank, had to say on this retaliation. We are on the verge of a global transformation. All we need is the right major crisis, and the nation will accept the new world order. So they already have something ready for us, so we must be ready. But remember, it will be over quickly with the right leadership. And finally, remember this is what we are getting rid of, with a solution that is not radical in the slightest. Start quote. Banking is conceived in inequality and born in sin. Bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money and control credit, and with the flick of a pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again. Take this great power away from the bankers, and all great fortunes like mine will disappear. And they ought to disappear, for this would be a better and happier world to live in. But if you want to continue the slaves of bankers and pay the cost of our own slavery, let them continue to create money and to control the credit. Sir Joseph Stamp. But there is indeed a movement of this going on today, called the sovereignty movement. They are trying to get the Treasury to issue their $90 billion per year to give to local communities interest-free for needed capital improvements. 3,200 cities and counties have endorsed the movement as of 1996. Even the Community Bankers Association of Illinois, representing 515 banks, also endorse it. But it's not nearly enough. It could all be done so fast if we were to get President Trump to do it all with executive orders. In fact, he has a very big picture of Andrew Jackson in his office. And if not, I'll do it. I am already doing my best to raise money with multiple businesses I run that try to save humanity in other ways. Finally, remember to not be a shitty person, and let the money we have today kill you, because men become like their oppressors. This will save society and bring us together. A small group of people can change the world. In fact, it is the only thing that ever has. In conclusion, Fractional reserve banking is the main enemy. Every dollar that is printed puts us in debt for that dollar plus interest. In short, they control the money supply. The central bank scam is a hidden tax. The nation sells bonds to the bank to pay for things it does not have the political will to raise taxes to pay for. But bonds are paid for with money that the central bank creates out of nothing. More money in circulation makes your money worth less every second of every day. The government gets anything and the people pay for it in inflation. That is the hidden tax. They want the central bank as a way to indefinitely control a nation's money supply without any leaders getting in their way. They can decide if money is easy to borrow or not. If supply goes up, then more loans are given out. Then they tighten the money supply, so then a certain percentage of people can't pay back their loans and can't take out new loans to repay the old ones. So they go bankrupt and have to sell their assets, homes, and land to the banks for pennies on the dollar. Fractional reserve banking has very interesting patterns that have been playing out for over and over for the past 500 years. We can learn from them to destroy the fact that money enslaves us rather than being a simple tool as it should be. The problem continues because people simply do not understand the system, partially because the system is made to be deceiving so that the goyim never find out. But the solution is just as simple and easy to implement for someone with the confidence in what they are doing. Once the fractional reserve banking is eliminated from Earth, then we can examine the genetics of why it all happened in the first place with the goldsmiths trying to not get caught lying. 1 year of blank and heaven on earth will be right under our feet.